In the last lecture, I talked about the role of mining in national economies and gave some examples. And I want to review some of that at the beginning of the lecture today in light of the issues we're seeing now throughout the United States and around the world surrounding social justice and how it also ties to environmental justice. So I put a set of slides together with the hopes of giving you some sense of what I'll call in the lecture today the resource curse of countries in the developing world where mining of resources and the export of those resources has overwhelmingly benefited citizens of already developed countries, what I've referred to in previous lectures as more developed countries. So if we look at here a plot of world population versus world mineral production, so we've got population on the y-axis and mineral production on the y-axis versus time. We can see that world population over the last 120 years has increased from about 1 billion people in 1900 to in excess of 7 billion people today. And if you look at the amount of copper that humans have consumed, meaning mined and consumed since 1900, you can see that from about 1900 to about 1950, copper production, or the increase of copper production annually, was about equal to the increase in population. And then you can see following World War II, as we started to build Levittown and suburbs similar to Levittown around the developed world, we started building skyscrapers, we electrified our world, we started driving vehicles, and on average, people in the developing world started owning more than one car per family. You can see over the last 70 years that copper consumption has increased at a rate faster than population increase. And we see this with almost every resource that we can evaluate. So here I've got gem diamonds. And again, if you want on your own time, go back and look at the marketing campaigns that really stimulated the belief in this concept that every marriage has to start with someone giving their prospective spouse a diamond ring. So if you look at gem diamonds, you can see here on the bottom that certainly consumption increased. And then you see this incredible rate of increase in the 1960s, a slight drop in the 1970s, and then in the early 1980s, you see this incredible rise, which is due to a number of factors. Among them, really savvy strategic marketing that again convinced us we all needed to have diamonds. And also, if you look around the world in developing countries, 1980 is the time when we really start to see dual income families. And we see a transition from the classic nuclear family where dad went to work and mom stayed home and took care of the kids. And in the 1980s, we saw that shift to mom and dad both started working, which meant more discretionary income. And more discretionary income means buying more things, and among more things are gem-grade diamonds. And we see this in oil as well. So now we've got oil here as the solid black line, and oil is essentially off the charts. You know, the first mass production automobile here outside of Detroit was circa 1900, and oil, as we'll see in a lecture next week, we use to produce gasoline or petrol that we put into combustion engine vehicles to drive them. And you can see that oil consumption just skyrocketed over the last 120 years as we transitioned from 1900, where no one drove an automobile, to 2020, where automobiles are a ubiquitous part of our built environment. If you look at metal and mineral production over my lifetime, the first edition of our textbook was published in 1992. And all I want you to take away from this slide is that as a function of time, the reason that mining companies do what they do is society attaches value to energy minerals and metals and industrial minerals. So mining companies wouldn't do what they do unless there were somebody buying their products. We talked about this in a previous slide. So on the left is this theoretical evolution of a country. When it's young, it mines resources that are the low-hanging fruit at the surface of the earth, the resources we trip over. It exports those mineral resources, and then there's usually an awakening within that country where business owners realize rather than simply exporting the raw materials, why don't we keep the raw materials here and manufacture things with them? This is that processed mineral production. And so over time, social license to mine and manufacture decreases. And what we see here with the growth of the raw mineral imports is countries become averse to mining and manufacturing, and they become service economies, which is what we see down here, Germany, Japan, US, UK, where there's very little mining being done. The majority of what we consume is imported from other countries. And this follows the curve on the right that is attributed to Simon Kuznets, who I described in a previous lecture, where young countries tolerate pollution, and as pollution increases, they become industrial economies, and eventually they reach a turning point, which in the United States correlated with the smog and acid rain in the middle and latter part of the 20th century. And then after that turning point, again, the residents of the country no longer want the mining and pollution, and so they become a post-industrial economy, or what's commonly known as a service economy. I mentioned a former student of mine, Daniel Corfei from Liberia, and you can see here an iron mine, and I talked about the importance of the revenues from iron mining for the country of Liberia. And I just want to give you some sense that Liberia is not a one-off. So every year in Toronto, Canada, there's a conference at the beginning of March which has this acronym, PDAC, and it stands for Prospectors Developers Association of Canada. And it's an international conference that attracts, give or take, 30 to 35,000 people a year from every aspect of the mining industry, including the financial arms, the banks that loan money for mining operations. And this is one photo I took at a conference there a few years ago. And each one of these is a booth. And when you walk around the PDAC convention floor, you see a lot of booths that are sponsored by countries. Here's the booth sponsored by China. China is the world's second leading economy. China has the world's largest population by country. China is also a very active mining and manufacturing economy. And China now is at that turning point where they want to transition away from an economy that produces pollution to a service economy that does not. You see other countries. Here's Nicaragua, which exhibits every year at PDAC, advertising the resources, their low-hanging fruit that mining companies can come to Nicaragua and extract out of the ground. And the hope is that the revenue from that extraction, or the taxes that the company pays, those resource rents that we talked about in the previous lecture, that they allow the overall economy of Nicaragua to grow. Here's Peru, also a resource-rich country, a developing country, advertising their resources to the international marketplace. Ireland is a country you may not think of as a mining country, but it has a strong mining tradition, and it's also the home to a number of different mining companies who come to PDAC to interact and engage with developing countries to discuss future mining operations. Australia is a huge mining company, a mining country, and they advertise here. Brazil, a very resource-rich country, they advertise. Chile is a very resource-rich country, and I'll come back and talk about them today. They're advertising here, and everyone here representing Chile is dressed in their finest Sunday outfits. Guyana is a country in northern South America, a former British colony that was known to produce sugar in the 17 and 1800s, and Guyana is a resource-rich country. And I mentioned a previous student of mine, Nikita La Cruz, who's from Guyana, and she gave a talk at this conference a couple of years ago about her research focused on gold exploration in Guyana. Finland, again, a country you might not think of as an active mining country, but Finland has lots of mineral resources, and so they're here advertising for companies to come to Finland to mine. Bolivia, another country that is a resource-rich country, advertising all of the metals you can see here on the wall that are their low-hanging fruit as a potential source of revenue as they want to develop and improve their economy. We've got here another poster from Bolivia, and I just highlight this one because this one is emphasizing responsible mining. So countries in the developed world are not able to anymore get the social license to go into developing countries such as Bolivia unless they engage in responsible mining. Colombia, I've got a current graduate student who's from Colombia, and Colombia also advertises here. Colombia is a developing country, what's sometimes referred to as a second world country, and they're advertising all of the resources available in Colombia for international companies to come and mine. India also advertises. The country India has the world's second largest population, and India is a resource-rich country, and they have here a geologic map of the Himalaya Mountains, and on that geologic map they're highlighting different types of mineral systems that companies might come and express an interest in. Ecuador, another developing country, advertising gold and other commodities that could be mined. Argentina, another developing country, advertising. Brazil, again. Countries such as Canada, which has a strong mining industry, and Germany. Germany has almost no mining industry, but here, Canada and Germany, they hosted a forum that focused on the future of mining and also focused on financing mining. Canada has different provinces as we have states, and so Ontario has their own exhibit. Quebec has their own exhibit. Manitoba has their own exhibit, as well as the Yukon and British Columbia. Barbados is a country in the Caribbean that is not a country that is known for mining, but Barbados has a significant financial industry. You can think of it as offshore banking. So Barbados is a hotspot for banking transactions that allow financing for mining operations around the world. So Barbados is here talking with both mining companies and also countries about how they can help secure financial transactions for mining operations. And then I'll show you here a few slides for Mongolia. So here's Mongolia. Here's a map in the bottom part here. So we've got India at the bottom, China and Mongolia up here, and the capital Ulaanbaatar. Mongolia also exhibits at PDAC, and they pull out all the stops. So they have a huge exhibit at PDAC, and they even show, or they have musicians come in to play music at their exhibits. So the question I want you to have in your head is, why are any of these countries here exhibiting? And I'll use Mongolia here as an example. So here we're looking at a map from the World Bank that I showed you in one of the previous lectures. And again, the numbers over here bottom right are the percent for each country of their total economy, their gross domestic product, that is a direct result of mining. If we look up here at the top of South America, here we've got Guyana, extremely resource rich, and those resources, their extraction and the revenue are important. Here we've got Mongolia in 1970, and notice that it's white. In 1970, Mongolia effectively exported no resources. Now look at 2017, the latest year for which the World Bank has data. Almost 29% of Mongolia's economy is dependent on revenue from mining and resources. So they went from effectively zero 50 years ago to now almost a third of their economy depends on the extraction of resources, the low-hanging fruit that we trip over, and export of those resources. And you see this when you look at, here's a map from the U.S. Geological Survey, and here's the URL if anybody wants to look at this on your own. But here we are, I'll trace out Mongolia here. And all I want you to see is that each one of these different symbols represents a mineral deposit or an ore deposit in the ground. So every one of these symbols literally represents that low-hanging fruit where the country of Mongolia can allow international companies access to those mineral deposits. And when the companies mine the deposits, and they export and sell those resources, some proportion of the profit is returned to Mongolia, and those revenues now are almost a third of the Mongolian economy, which has stimulated rapid economic growth in Mongolia in your lifetime. And you can see that here is a pie chart for the exports from Mongolia. And if you just look at the ones that dominate, almost half of the exports are coal that is exported to other countries where it's used. Zinc, crude oil, copper is almost 20%, and gold is 3%. So if you just look at the names around the pie chart, these are the resources that are returning revenues to Mongolia. And I don't say here that this is right or wrong, it's just the observation of fact. And again, I encourage you to look into this on your own time. These are data from 2019 from the World Bank. And again, these are the top 10 exports from Mongolia in terms of total dollar value. And if we read through them, number 1, minerals. Number 2, minerals. Number 3, minerals. Number 4 is wool, also a resource. Number 5, copper. Number 6, mineral resources. Then we have 7 and 8 are different types of meat and seafood. And we jump down to 10 and we get oil seeds. So if we look at the top 10 exports, which account for 98.6% of the overall value of exports from Mongolia, a majority of them are natural resources that we've talked about in this class. And that now has resulted in an economy for the country of Mongolia where approximately a third is dependent on the revenue from resource extraction and export. One of the concepts that is incredibly fascinating, and there are lots and lots of academic papers and books written about this, is known as the resource curse. And this is a great book here that I would highly recommend anybody reading if you want to get up to date on this topic, and or Google this and you'll find lots of great articles. But the resource curse, if I can apply that here to Mongolia, is this concept that Mongolia now is roughly 1/3 dependent on export of natural resources. So it's a young country, as we've talked about in previous lectures and earlier in this lecture. And a question is, how does Mongolia use those resources? If those resources are exported and the revenue paid in terms of resource rent is not spent well to develop an infrastructure in Mongolia that will outlast the resources, then that leads to this curse, this resource curse that has been written about on countries. We see the same thing in Chile. So this looks like a complicated diagram. All I want you to focus on is this is for the country Chile, and I just want you to take 17% and 34%. And if you add those two together, almost half of Chile's exports are the metal copper. Chile is the #1 copper producer in the world. And as a result of copper production, Chile's economy has boomed in my lifetime. So here I've got data for the gross domestic product per capita or per person in constant $2,000, so it's inflation adjusted, from 1800 through about 2015. And all I want to highlight is that Chile's economy was doing well, and you can see it's just progressively improving. And then you start to see 1950, it starts to climb. And notice here, this is about the time 1970. 1970, it just takes off. And around 1970 is when Chile started to dominate the global copper production market. And copper just took off, as did the economy, because of all the new jobs, the mining investment in local towns and communities, all of the resource rent that was being paid to the Chilean government. That was directly responsible for much of this growth of the Chilean economy. Depending on the year, if you look at Chile here, just focus the number 66%. That's the percent total for Chile's GDP contributed from mining and exporting natural resources. It's a massive amount of money that is returned to Chile. One of the things in Chile and all resource-rich countries that they watch is shown here in probably dark brown to you, is copper price. And so this is for the time period 2005 to 2014. And I just want you to see the copper price that I'm tracing over, and I'll come back to that in today's lecture. And notice that as the copper price goes up and down, big down here, comes back up, starts to go down, the histogram is Chile's GDP. So just think of this as the economy got 6% better here, 6.5% better here, and then notice here in the middle, this is after the financial recession that crippled the entire world after the mortgage crisis in the United States in 2006, 7, 8. You can see that as the price of copper dropped in response to less discretionary income following the mortgage crisis, we saw that Chile's economy, or GDP, actually contracted and was negative growth for a couple of years. So Chile monitors this all the time, and I've got lots of words on this slide. You know, lithium, molybdenum, copper, gold, silver. You know, Chile is a big wine producer. But all I want to highlight is that Chile, one of the reasons for their significant economic growth in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s was they were selling much of their copper to China. And China, as their economy has contracted in the last few years, is buying less copper. So Chile is concerned, and this has also led to something that we're seeing now in the United States. It's led to lots of protests.
Another day of protests have paralyzed much of downtown Santiago, Chile. Tensions in the city remain high as thousands of demonstrators continue to flood the streets. Victor Santibáñez is a professional driver. He hasn't participated in the protests, but he shares the frustrations of demonstrators.
I have my own vehicle, and I work with dignity and abide by the law. But what has that meant for me? It's meant throwing my money away in taxes. If I don't pay my share, I could lose my house. But not that big businessman. They don't pay, and then they get bailed out. What about me?
Since the weekend, protests have continued to intensify. Every day, it seems more sectors of society are joining in the demonstrations. On Tuesday evening, Chilean President Sebastián Piñera announced a national plan to improve social programs in an effort to calm the unrest.
This situation of inequity, abuse, has led to a genuine and sincere movement on behalf of millions and millions of Chileans. I recognize and demand forgiveness for the lack of vision.
Social analysts like Manuel Garretón believe the unrest is part of a growing movement of young people who he says are rejecting the very notion of Chile's political system.
There is a commonality among the demonstrators, the theme of calling for equality and denouncing abuse, but also the possibility of a better future. The perspective people have today is that things are bad now, but the future will be even worse for their children.
Apart from anger over growing inequality, protesters have also denounced a heavy-handed crackdown by police and armed forces against peaceful protesters. A state of emergency and a military-enforced curfew remains in effect here in the Chilean capital for the fourth day in a row. That means thousands of the city's residents are forced to return to their homes every day before sunset or run the risk of being arrested for a curfew violation. More than 5,400 people have been arrested nationwide since the start of the crisis, with thousands of protesters continuing to defy curfew and declaring a national strike for the coming days. That number is sure to rise. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera, Santiago, Chile.
So this was last year in Santiago. This is not 10, 20, 30 years ago. This was last year. And what you're looking at here are people largely in your age demographic, people in their teens, 20s, and 30s, who are frankly frustrated, pissed off that they see tremendous economic growth in Chile as a whole, but when they look at their own economic opportunities, they don't feel that they are part of that growth. So the plot you're looking at here is a histogram where on the bottom we've got lots of countries, and the United States is over here, and Chile I've highlighted in red. And what you're looking at here is the Gini index, and the Gini index is, think of it as a number between 0 and 1. A Gini index coefficient of 0 means complete equality. Everybody makes the same exact salary and has the same economic opportunities. If you have a Gini index of 1, it's complete inequality. Now these data are for 2018 and some for 2019, but let's assume for 2020 they remained essentially unchanged. And when you look at the Gini index, here would be a 0.5. What Chile has seen is they've seen this Gini index increase. So people who are in their 20s and 30s are frustrated that Chile in their parents' generation was able to transition from a developing country to more or less now a developed country, and yet the wealth transfer is not raising up the lower classes across the country. And if I highlight the United States here with a Gini index of about 0.4, not too much lower than Chile, I think you can also see a lot of frustration among students around the United States at similar feelings of the lack of wealth transfer from the top to the bottom. And again, I encourage you to read about this on your own time, because there are a lot of parallels between what went on in Chile last year and what you see throughout the United States. So here are just some data, and again, these are not going to be on the exam, so you can either fast forward or pause and look at them if you're interested. But looking at population growth in Chile, if you take a look at the Gini index overall in the last century, it has gone up, but then young people in Chile see this drop, and they're not convinced that Chile as a country will return to a continually increasing Gini. We also see this in other places around the world, and I just want to make another connection here. So this is a photograph I pulled off of Google. I don't know where it is, except it's in an Apple store somewhere, and we can assume that everyone's smiling and likely happy thoughts are coming out of their mouths. They're happy for the release of a new iPhone. But I just want to highlight that with the release of every new iPhone, iPhones contain cobalt, and about 60% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo in sub-Saharan Africa. And about half of that cobalt is mined artisanally or illegally. It's not mined by large companies. And about 30% of that half comes from child labor. So one of the other issues that we are facing as a global society is the need to have strict regulations and enforcement of those regulations in developing countries to make sure that the mining practices in those countries is at the same standard as we require in the United States, in France, in Canada, in England. We can no longer allow child labor and artisanal mining where there are much higher rates of fatality and injury to produce the resources that overwhelmingly are used by products in my home and the homes of other people in the developed world. And I'll play you here a video just to give you a sense of this concept of artisanal mining of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Tech companies around the world are trying to clean up the way they source cobalt, a key ingredient in batteries for smartphones, laptops, and electric cars. But conditions remain hazardous in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is where about 2/3 of the world's cobalt is mined.
We traveled to Kolwezi, the cobalt boom town of Congo. These guys are climbing into these holes, straddling railroad ties and hauling up tons of cobalt with makeshift rope and no proper safety equipment or support whatsoever.
In January 2016, a human rights report alerted the world to how cobalt is often dug up by hand under unsafe, sometimes deadly conditions by subsistence miners, including children. Pressure began mounting on the businesses that use the metal in their products, since even suppliers that mine cobalt industrially often buy ore from so-called artisanal miners, also known by the French word creuseur.
There's been progress. So, when we started doing due diligence on your cobalt supply chain was not common. Now, what you find is that it's accepted in international forums, it's seen as something that needs to be done.
And using companies like Apple, for example, have been vocal about vetting their supply chain and making sure that their cobalt comes from companies that have mined in an ethically sound way. I think that our reporting shows that that's very difficult to actually know for sure.
Umicore has been a world leader in cobalt products.
Belgian chemical giant Umicore makes battery materials that end up in Apple and Samsung products, among others. It states on its website that it has sourced cobalt responsibly for more than a decade.
We aim to ensure that no unethically mined cobalt enters our process.
But this open pit worked by thousands of independent miners is owned by a local mining company called Chemaf that says it sells cobalt to Umicore. People work in bare feet with little or no safety equipment. Umicore's senior vice president, Guy Etier, denied that any of the cobalt it buys from Chemaf comes from Mutoshi. Apple lists Umicore as a supplier on its website, but declined to comment on Chemaf. Samsung confirmed that some of the cobalt it buys from Chemaf comes from Mutoshi, and third-party audits are planned for the end of the year. At the Mutoshi mine site, there appeared to be no child miners, one of the major points of the Amnesty International report.
They had said that they'd cleared out children a few months before, and we didn't find any working on the mines there.
Chemaf also told the Wall Street Journal that it plans to invest in safety and monitoring. Meanwhile, thousands of people continue to work here to support their families in one of the only ways available to them. That's why advocates and stakeholders emphasize that they are looking for ways to improve conditions in these kinds of cobalt mines, not shut them down.
One of the things we worry about is the stigmatization of artisanal mining. The idea that in and of itself it is a bad thing and you can't source ethical cobalt from artisanal mines, which is not right.
We see as a result of the livelihood impact that it's having, it's worth kind of trying to better as opposed to trying to somehow shoo away. It's not going to go away if you look at poverty statistics in the Congo.
The workers at the depot where ore is tested wore uniforms and helmets, but the vast majority of miners observed on a recent visit by the Wall Street Journal had no protective equipment, and their concerns go beyond safety and lack of basic services like water and medical care. They say Chemaf controls the equipment that determines the value of the ore they deliver to its depot, and since most of the workers cannot afford smartphones, they can't track cobalt prices.
They weren't really ever sure if they were getting a fair deal.
Chemaf says it provides the fairest and most competitive prices possible. In July, the audit firm RCS Global launched a pilot program in Congo aimed at helping companies keep track of the conditions at official mine sites. In these recent clips provided by RCS, independent monitors can be seen at an artisanal mine that supplies China's largest cobalt company, Huayu Cobalt, which says it has implemented a system to better manage its supply chain.
Where I have a field agent who is busy collecting data with a smartphone-based application.
RCS Global says it plans to publish its findings based on anonymized data from across multiple mining operations.
It's not necessarily about giving a company a pass or a fail.
The goal is to keep track of whether or not the situation on the ground is changing.
So I showed you that video because I want you to associate my use of the concept low-hanging fruit with cobalt. Cobalt is necessary to make smartphones work. Cobalt is at the surface in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Cobalt represents the low-hanging fruit that is a revenue stream for families. And notice that the interviewees in the video don't say artisanal mining in and of itself is bad, but it's the absence of regulation, the absence of safety equipment, the absence of strict safety protocols. That's what's bad about this situation. Something else that was mentioned also is the individual miners, the artisanal miners. They mine cobalt and then they sell that cobalt to a company, and that company then sells it upstream. So the miners have no access to know what the price of that cobalt is and whether or not they're being fairly compensated for that cobalt. So I want to transition now and talk a little bit about natural resources prices. And I'm going to set the framework around a hypothetical mining company that wants to do a project. And I'm going to take your mind back to the Pebble project that we've talked about in South Central Alaska, where for the better part of 30, almost 40 years, one particular company has sought and secured financing for all of the exploration and drilling and all of the permitting that still has not been approved to allow Pebble to become a mine, because the mining company cannot get the social license to mine in that particular area. one of the biggest challenges for mining companies is what's shown on this slide and what we can think of as negative cash flow. So if you think about the typical cash flow for a capital-intensive project, and capital means money or dollars, so capital here would be cash. Intensive, obviously mining projects are intensive. If we imagine starting at time 0, and we look here on the y-axis, where from time 0, we investigate the site, we demonstrate that a mine is possible, we get the financing to build the mine, so we construct our facility, we go through all of the permitting, and then the project is green lighted, and let's say we start blasting, detonating, shoveling, and hauling out the overburden to get to the ore grade rock. What companies experience, if this is a break-even line here, so a company's operating in the black where they're making money, or they're operating in the red where they're losing money below this 0 line, companies have negative cash flow for a significant amount of time until they actually sell enough of whatever resource they're mining is, that they earn enough revenue from that resource, that they have paid back all of the loans from banks that funded all of the exploration and site investigation, all of the construction, that paid for all of the mining equipment, paid for all the permits that have to be acquired. So all of this represents negative cash flow. And by capital investment, mining companies are typically borrowing this money from banks, JP Morgan, Chase, Goldman Sachs, etc. They're borrowing that money, and the reason that those banks loan the money is that they are convinced by the mining company that eventually the mining company operates with negative cash flow, but then once the mining company starts to operate and produce, then they climb out of this negative cash flow hole, and they have what is referred to here as positive cash flow. And once they have that positive cash flow, that means profit that can be used to pay back the loans. And so all of the banks are willing to engage in these activities if they're convinced by the mining companies that there will be a positive return on their investment. Now, this is an example from our textbook, figure 6.6, for a hypothetical mineral deposit that has an initial investment of $1 million. So just think of this as Goldman Sachs has invested $1 million, and that $1 million was already spent in exploration and developing the deposits. So now we're going to start producing. And so notice there are 1, 2, 3, 4 lines here. And for these 3 lines, there's a percentage that's referred to as the discount rate. And I want you to think of the discount rate as the interest rate. On the y-axis is value in thousands of dollars. And I just want you to focus on the red arrows I've drawn here, where if the mine starts operating at year 0, here would be year 2, year 4, year 6, year 8, year 10. This would be a 10% interest rate. And what that means is that if the company borrowed $1 million and they're paying a 10% interest rate or discount rate, notice that they start operating at 0, and it takes them almost 5 years to pay back that loan. If they borrow at an interest rate of 20%, it takes them from year 0 almost 7 years to pay back that original $1 million. And if they borrow at an interest rate of 30%, notice that it's somewhere off the chart here. It takes them almost 12, 13 years to pay back that loan. So this concept of negative cash flow is extremely important for mining companies, because remember that that interest rate is the money that banks make for loaning the $1 million. So Goldman Sachs has to be paid back the $1 million or the principal on the loan, and then they're also earning interest on top of that principal. And that interest is also cutting into the profit of the mining company. So one of the things that is done by mining companies around the world, and also financial service companies such as Goldman Sachs, is they're looking at what is the payback period, the rate of return on their initial investment. How long will it take the mining company to pay Goldman Sachs back their initial $1 million with the interest rate attached to that contract? Now, one of the things that makes this challenging both for mining companies and also for the financial service firms is that mining companies don't control the price of metals. So I'm going to walk through now an example of the price of copper. And this is data from 1989 through 2015. And all I want you to see here is that the y-axis is the price of copper in dollars per pound of copper. So at the end of the mining process, after electrolytic refining, somebody has pure metal copper, and what is the value of that pure metal copper per pound? And I just want you to see, as I trace over it, that the price goes down, up, down, up, down, up. Here's a big up, then it drops, big up, big drop. Goes up, boom, big drop. This is the drop associated with the global recession that I talked about a few minutes ago with implications for the Chilean economy. Then we see the copper price starts to go up. So if you're a mining company and you see these ups and downs, this is your worst nightmare. Because remember that when you're planning a mining infrastructure, you're going to build a mine, you're banking, no pun intended, on the future price of copper being high enough that you can recover all of your initial investment and pay the interest to the company who loaned you the money. So when we talk about copper or other natural resources, the price of copper and those natural resources are set by what I call here speculators. They're not set by the mining company. They're not set by federal regulators around the world. They're set by speculators who buy and sell copper as what we call copper futures, meaning that they're buying copper at a fixed price now for copper delivery in the future. So it's not that somebody on the stock market buys copper today and then gets that copper tomorrow. They're buying what we call a contract to take possession of copper in the future. And these are data here. This is October 26th, 2016 through December. Actually, let me take that back. No, this is October 26th, so one day. And I just want to highlight here that if you look across the course of a day, you can see the price goes up and down. And on the right-hand side over here is dollars per pound of copper. And you can see that it goes, at this point in time, it was $2.135. Here would be $2.143. Here would be $2.125. And you might look at this and think, well, those prices aren't really fluctuating that much. How much of an impact could that have on a company? Now, contracts come in specific sizes. So each contract of copper, as I'm tracing over here at the bottom, is for 25,000 pounds of copper, which means that when you buy a copper contract, if you buy one contract, you are contractually obligated to take possession of 25,000 pounds of copper at some future date that's part of the contract. Now, I walk through some of the math here, but I'll give you the highlights. When you buy a contract for copper, you only have to actually pay upfront 8% of the real value of the contract. And this 8% of the real value of the contract is what we call a margin. So if we look at the price of copper on one particular day in January 2018, and it's $3.0220 per pound, and let's say we buy a contract for one contract for copper, which means 25,000 pounds of copper. That means it would have a value of $75,550, which requires on the margin that we would make a down payment of $6,044. So all I have to do is pay $6,044, and I then have a contract that guarantees delivery of 25,000 pounds of copper to me in the future. Now, most of the people who buy copper never actually want to take possession of copper. They're simply speculating that if they buy copper at this price, $3.0220 per pound, the price will go up, and then they sell their contract to somebody else. That is what drives the changes in the copper market almost to a second around the world when the stock markets are open, because people are buying and selling and buying and selling and buying and selling, And remember that the mining company has nothing to do with this. So if you look at these websites that I've given you here, you can get a sense of how this changes in real time. And I invite you to do that and talk with me during office hours. But I just want to give you some of the overall highlights here of the impact of these so-called future prices on mining companies. So again, here would be copper, a different date, and just notice the ups and downs. What mining companies have to do is they have to plan for a future where they cannot control the price of copper that they will produce at the end of the mining process after electrolytic refining. So what happens for mining companies is that they're constantly keeping track of all of the copper futures as well as every other resource. And as it relates to running a copper exploration and mining business, they're constantly trying to figure out how they adjust their overall operating costs. If prices go up, do they increase production to take advantage of higher prices? As prices go down, do they decrease production to leave more ore grade rock in the ground and reduce costs by perhaps furloughing or firing workers so they reduce their overall costs? One of the things that you need to know is that for any mining company, it's at least 10 years or a decade before any company starts to build a mining infrastructure and actually makes copper available for sale. And that's because of all of the environmental permitting and all of the regulations that go along with mine opening. So when a mine company is borrowing money, they're borrowing money knowing that it's at least a decade until they will earn revenue to be able to pay back those loans. So if we go back to the example of the Pebble deposit here, where we've got a cross section here in the top that you've seen many times, they propose to start mining on the west side of the deposit because the highest copper and gold grades in red and blue are on the west side of the deposit. That's the low-hanging fruit. And then the mine pit will get deeper to the east over 40, 50, 60, 70 years. Now, in terms of recovering their costs, the colors here correspond to the life of the mining operations. And notice that for a typical mine, exploration to define a mineral resource is at least several, if not more than 10 years. In the case of Pebble, it's been several decades. And then it takes at least a few years to design and build the mine infrastructure. And then in yellow here, the mine can operate for several years to as long as a century. So Bingham Canyon has been operating for 114 years. Then we've got closure and decommissioning here, where the mine has to reclaim all of that land. And then the mining company is on the hook in perpetuity to monitor the mine site. So all of that negative cash flow is all of one, all of two, and probably the first few years of number 3 before the mine company starts making a profit. So how does that actually affect when we think about copper futures? I'll just give you one example. And these are data that are somewhat old now, but they deliver the message I want you to receive. One of the world's biggest mining companies is called Freeport-McMoRan, and it's an American mining company based in Arizona. In 2013, they produced 1.03 billion pounds of copper, which is equal to about 41,200 contracts worth of copper. So around the world, investors or speculators bought 41,200 contracts worth of copper, and that copper was only the copper produced by one company. If the market price changes by 28 cents per pound, let's say it goes from $3 a pound to $2.72 a pound, that results in a value decrease of almost $300 million. So for one company with almost 40,000 employees and 40,000 additional contractors around the world, a price change of 28 cents means that they lose almost $300 million. This is why mining companies hire people from economics and business majors who constantly use numerical algorithms to predict the price of copper futures so that mining companies will know when to ramp up production and when to ramp down production. And again, lots of newspaper articles written about this, especially with China, as they had a voracious appetite for copper in the 90s and 2000s, and that has scaled off in the last few years. And this is just one from that same time period where that company, Freeport-McMoRan, they saw their profits drop by about a third. So what are problems with futures contracts? Well, from the mining company's perspective, one of the problems is that they have no say in what those prices are. They are legally not allowed to engage in speculation. So all of the futures contracts prices are determined by people who do not work for mining companies. One of the biggest problems is the historic ability to fix the price. And I encourage you to read lots of articles about these two guys here, two brothers known as the Hunt brothers. Their father was a very successful businessman, and they took money from those businesses. And what they did is they cornered the silver market. So just like copper, the metal silver is also traded by people who buy silver's futures. And if you walk through the timeline here, I'm not going to hold you to all these details. In the early 1970s, the two brothers, they started buying on margin silver futures. And as they bought more and more futures contracts for silver, people around the world who invested in silver started taking notice. And over this period, from the early 70s to the late 70s, the Hunt brothers started acquiring so many silver futures, and they weren't making that silver available. They simply owned the contract for future delivery, that investors panicked. And what I'm highlighting here on the right-hand side of the slide is those investors panicked and thought that this really represented some significant decline in silver production, and there would be some sort of silver scare where the world was running out of silver. So everybody jumped on this and started buying futures contracts, which was great for the Hunt brothers, except for the fact that they had what was called a margin call. As the price of silver futures went up, the stock markets required them to increase their percentage or total dollar that they put down for the futures contracts. They couldn't make that, and then they shut it down. They literally shut down the futures markets, and the price tanked. So it went up instantaneously and it dropped instantaneously on what's known as Silver Thursday. The value of silver fell by more than 50%, and the Hunt brothers lost almost $1 billion from the failure of the silver market that they had tried to corner. And this is just the same data here, the same two Hunt brothers. And I just highlight here that they're cornering the silver market. They caused the price of silver futures to increase by more than 2,000%. And the questions here, does this impact exploration? Does it impact company finances? The answers are both yes. For details I'm not going to get into, but just know that these price excursions, these instantaneous increases, are something that concern mining companies. And now we have much stronger regulations around the world that are designed to prevent any episode like this caused by the Hunt brothers in the 1970s and very early 1980s. And again, a great article here written in the New York Times Magazine about a decade ago if you want to read the details. Other things that affect futures that are unpredictable. So here I've got a timeline for gold from the early 70s through the late 2000s. And all I want you to take away here we've got somebody holding a gold bar, is this is gold price per ounce on the y-axis. And all I want you to see is these are things that no one predicted. In the early 70s, there was what we call the oil crisis, with the OPEC countries around the world eliminating their exports to the United States, which caused our oil crisis. We have Russia invading Afghanistan. We have inflation within the United States and globally. We have sanctions in South Africa. We have in the mid 1990s, there was a big real estate collapse, and so we have bank sales. We have Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. And then we start running into the credit crunch that led to the mortgage failure in 2007-8. And all I want you to see is this red line tracks the price of gold. And all of these events, which mining companies have no ability to predict and no ability to control, all of these affect gold prices. And certainly when gold prices go up because companies and investors are buying gold because they view it as a safe asset to put in the mattress and hold on to, when prices go up, that's a good thing. But when prices go down, that's a bad thing. So mining companies have to be very fiscally conservative when they plan their operations. And again, just more data to give you a sense of the effect of unpredictable events. In this case, Bear Stearns collapsing in 2008, and then a number of other major issues that resulted from the mortgage collapse crisis in the United States. So, two topics left for today's lecture. The first is going to be on taxing resource producers. And I just want to remind everybody listening on the call, most people don't like paying taxes. You can read these details if you want to pause it on your own time, but here's one of the founders of Facebook who gave up U.S. citizenship to become a citizen of Singapore to pay fewer taxes. Here we have lots of articles written about Apple not paying taxes. Apple claims they pay all their taxes. They don't stash their money on some Caribbean island. Well, it turns out they stashed their money on an island here between England and France in the English Channel. Burger King did a huge tax inversion where Burger King, a big company, bought Tim Hortons, a little company, and then Burger King, a U.S. company, relocated their corporate headquarters to Canada so that the company combined paid less taxes in Canada than they. So companies have always tried to use every loophole to move money from their primary country to another country. And you can take a look here and again, read this on your own time, companies and their offshore profits that have been a focus of the Trump administration. So I just want to give you here sort of the umbrella idea of how companies are taxed, how mining companies are taxed. And I'm going to walk through an example, but I just want you to come away with an understanding of the concept of taxes and profit and how they can be used by mining companies. I'll use the example of the Lornex copper deposit in British Columbia. And Lornex is shown here. It's a big open pit mine. And it has shareholder equity now. You could ignore all of these dollars here. In 1979, the mine was owned by Lornex Mining Company. And there were then partial owners under Lornex Mining Company. And you could ignore all the rest of this text. In 1975, they produced almost 13 million tons of ore. And of that tons of ore, about 0.5% of it was copper and about 0.016% was molybdenum, which is a metal byproduct from sulfides that are also being smelted to produce copper. They produced a concentrate, they sent it to Japan. Remember, Japan doesn't mine their own copper, they import. So they sent it to Japan, Japan smelted it, and then after smelting, they had 107,160,000 pounds of copper, 3,084,000 pounds of molybdenum. The numbers are not relevant. The value of copper and molybdenum at the time, if we look back at the futures contracts, the total value of all of this copper and molybdenum was just shy of $65 million. And the company in Japan paid Lornex $51,040,000 for the concentrate. So why didn't Lornex get all $65 million? Why did they only get $51 million? Well, the reason, this number 5, why the difference, is that is the metal price on the open market, on the stock exchange, and Lornex is being paid for the concentrate, and then the company in Japan who smelts that concentrate and then produces metallic copper and gold, their profit comes between the difference of 65 million and 51 million. The question for Lornex is all of that $51 million profit? What do you think? Lornex built the mine, they mined all the ore grade rock, they got all of the overburden out of the way, they sent it all to Japan, they covered those costs, and then they get a check for $51 million. The answer is no, it's not all profit. So what mining companies do is they have what's called total income, and their total income would be $51,043,000. They then have all of their expenses. So it costs them $30,818,000 in order to mine all of those millions of pounds of copper and molybdenum. So these are their expenses. They then what we call amortization and depreciation. And just think of this as IRS rules both in the United States and in other countries that allow companies to progressively write down the overall cost of equipment that they own. So they take the total income, subtract the operating expenses, subtract amortization and depreciation. They then also had to pay interest on their loan. So remember the negative cash flow example? They were paying interest to a bank who loaned them the money to do all of the mining. So they paid $6,146,000 in interest, which means they had a net earnings of $8,162,000. And a question then is that profit? Is all of that earnings, after they cover all of their costs and pay interest, profit? So then they paid taxes on that profit. So the taxes on $8,162,000 were $7,536,000, leaving them with $626,000 in profit. So notice that of the earnings, almost 95% of their net earnings were paid to the government in the form of taxes. And you'll hear a lot and read a lot written in the popular press and lots of books written about this, about is this a fair profit? And then people talk about why would we worry whether or not it is fair? And so this is something mining companies grapple with all the time, right? If the price of copper goes up or down by only a few pennies on the dollar, that ultimately can result in mining activities being not profitable. So we write about this in the textbook, and I encourage you to read more details if you want. I just want you to take away the high-level issues here related to profit for mining operations. And again, I just put some extra slides in here. I'm not going to go through these in detail. These are for major companies around the world that are engaged in either oil and natural gas mining, or in the case of BHP and Rio Tinto, a wide variety of natural resources, including copper. And with BHP, they actually produce a lot of iron and coal. And you can walk through this. If you're an econ or business major, you might find this more interesting than most people in the class. But I just want to highlight that for these companies in 2013, when we calculated the data, these are the effective tax rates. And this is what you hear a lot about, especially during the Trump administration, companies pushing back on how much of the overall net earnings they pay in taxes. So this operating income is what we would call the net earnings or the earnings before taxes. And notice then that the taxes here can be significant. These are in millions of dollars, by the way, but they still have significant profit. But this is what companies want to reduce, the total tax burden, because the profit that remains after taxes, that's the profit that they use to do exploration for new resources to build new mines. And you see around the country and around the world that what happens when prices go up, and remember again, mining companies have no say in prices. When prices go up, this is an example from Nevada in 2009. Nevada is a major gold producing state. This is actually a large gold nugget from a mine called Round Mountain in central Nevada. And so one of the biggest mining companies in the world is producing gold at that particular mine. All of a sudden, gold prices went up, and the state of Nevada and their legislative body and the governor all of a sudden wanted to increase taxes. And you see this even Republicans. I mean, God forbid, Republicans wanted to double Nevada's mining tax because they view that as their low-hanging fruit. A gold mining company has been operating for decades. Gold prices go up. Let's increase taxes. And this is known as windfall profits tax. So the concept, in words here, windfall profits tax, is where prices for a particular metal all of a sudden increase, which means that the mining company is able to sell their metal for a new higher price. And government will come in and increase taxes or attempt to increase taxes so they get a larger percentage of those new revenues or new profit. And one of the observations is that this is terrible for the mining industry, and it's also terrible for governments. Because if you look here on the time scale on the x-axis, and we've got money on the y-axis, when governments institute a windfall profits tax, here's one example, they implement a windfall profits tax. What you see is that means there's less money for mining companies to do exploration. So they spend less money on exploration, they find new deposits, and when they find new deposits, it means that there's less mining in the future, which means less tax revenue for whatever the government is that controls the area where the mine is located. So how do we invest the tax revenues? Well, I mentioned here that what companies want to do is they want to take the profits and they would rather have more profit that they can invest in new mining activities. So if we go back to a slide we've seen today and in previous lecture, and we talk about young countries to economically old countries, resource-rich, low-hanging fruit, we mine and export it, then we manufacture, then we import. I'll use the example of Norway to illustrate a concept that we call sovereign wealth fund, where sovereign means government. So Norway is this country here in Scandinavia. And if you look at Norway, here we've got the country Norway on the right, here's Denmark and Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, here's England and Scotland. All I want you to see here is in purple, all of the black dots represent major oil and gas discoveries. And then down here in orange, we've got natural gas discoveries controlled by the Netherlands or the Dutch. So up here in purple, if we look at the white lines that divide the Norwegian sector from the British sector, Norway is a country that in my lifetime and my parents' lifetime saw a tremendous increase in the production of oil offshore. And they actually had a government company that did that oil exploration and mining called Statoil. And this is a large oil platform on the right-hand side. And just to give you a sense over here, for those of you interested in the numbers, Statoil was a huge company, is a huge company, more than 20,000 employees, significant profit that's returned to the government of Norway. And if we look at the timeline here, this is 1980. Just think of the y-axis as oil production. So from 1980 to 1990, oil production increased pretty significantly. It doubled over that 10-year period of time from about 800,000 barrels of oil a day to 1,600 barrels of oil a day. And what Norway did is they set up a sovereign wealth fund known as the Government Pension Fund Global, also sometimes nicknamed the Oil Fund, and they established this in 1990. And what they did is they said, okay, we are producing significant quantities of oil, we're selling that oil on the global market, and we're making profit on those sales. Let's invest that profit in a fund, which I've referred to as a sovereign wealth fund, and then that money is in essence a rainy day savings account that we can use later when oil revenue declines. Now, when we look at the value of that sovereign wealth fund, the oil fund here in Norway, all I want you to see is that they've invested it in different investment markets, real estate, fixed income, equities, ignore the details. But the total market value here in blue, I just want to highlight that it has grown significantly. And in fact, as of 2020, it exceeds $1 trillion, 1 trillion US dollars. Now, this is a savings account where the government of Norway said, rather than spend that money in real time, meaning rather than spend the profits as they come in, we will save it and invest it. And they've done this now, and this is a great article in Bloomberg from a couple of years ago, talking about Norway's swelling piggy bank. And they've done it, and they were incredibly smart to do so. So here's that same graph where oil production doubled from 1980 to 1990. It doubled again from 1990 to about the year 2000, where it plateaued, and in your lifetime, it has declined. And what Norway did back in the 90s is they had this realization that oil is finite. We know that as we pump oil out of the ground, nature does not replace it at nearly the rate that humans consume it. So it's a finite resource. So all of the profits made during the 90s and the 2000s, all of those profits were stockpiled and they were used to invest. And now Statoil is investing those profits in other types of energy, among them wind energy. And they have made the decision that as oil declines, or their ability to produce oil from offshore Norway is declining, they're now going to invest in other forms of energy around the world, including floating wind farms. And in 2016, December 23rd, 2016, Norway and their company Statoil, they won the contract. They had to bid through the Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management. They bid to build a 1 gigawatt wind farm off northern New Jersey and Long Island. And then they'll run electric lines into New York City. And the numbers over here you can disregard. But I just want you to see this is an example of how smart countries and companies can be at setting up these sovereign wealth funds to have that money available for future investments. And again, oil here in orange is Norway. The United Kingdom is green. Denmark is blue. Oil is declining, and now Norway has more than $1 trillion invested in renewable energy and other assets. These sovereign wealth funds, we see them around the world. There are sovereign wealth funds. In fact, the government of China has several of their own sovereign wealth funds. We see them in Australia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, in North America, in Latin America, and the Caribbean. And you can look this up on your own time, and they're ranked here. Norway has the most valuable sovereign wealth fund in the world. And what you'll see as you go down this list, I just want to make the point. Norway, oil. United Arab Emirates, oil. China, oil, natural gas, metals, and manufacturing. Saudi Arabia, oil. China. Kuwait, oil and natural gas. Singapore is a financial sector. When you go down this list, Russia, oil and natural gas. Qatar, oil and natural gas. Natural resource extraction and the sale of those resources are being used very intelligently by many countries around the world to build these sovereign wealth funds for future investment as oil and natural gas and other natural resources become exhausted. In the United States, some of our own states, Texas and New Mexico, have their own sovereign wealth funds, and they can be significant portions of the annual budget. And again, states view them as rainy day funds. So if you look, here's also Wyoming and Alabama, states that have their own sovereign wealth funds, North Dakota, right? And on the right-hand side, for these 6 states, I put the annual state budget. I think this was 2018 or 2019 when I pulled these data. But I just want to highlight that the state budget compares in some cases pretty well to these sovereign wealth funds, meaning that states during a time of financial crisis can tap into these to help offset decreasing tax revenues. And we come back to this resource curse. One of the concerns by people under the umbrella of sustainable development is around the world, are countries that are resource rich, are they using the revenues to avoid this resource curse? And in particular, Africa. Many countries in Africa are resource rich, and there have been a lot of articles, academic papers, and books written about countries in Africa not being fast enough to develop sovereign wealth funds, about graft and bribery and all of the profits that are being earned by countries via resource rents not being saved for the eventual improvement of these resource-rich countries. And again, I encourage you to read about this on your own time or talk with me during office hours. So when we think about Kuznets' curve, and we think about pre-industrial where we mine and export, we then become industrial economies where we manufacture, and then we transition to service economies. This has huge implications for environmental degradation. It has huge implications for social license. And as you think about economics and just the few examples and lip service I've given today with respect to developing countries around the world who once a year go to the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, and they try and essentially woo international companies to come to the developing world and extract resources and sell those resources to return revenue to those countries, there is a critical need for students of your age and generation to work to make sure that these resource-rich countries avoid the resource curse. Last couple of slides. This is a whole field unto itself. So if you're an econ or business or finance major, just know that this is an entire field, and mining companies hire you girls and guys all the time because they are in desperate need of making sure that they will be profitable in the future.